Hello and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality, the challenges it faces, and the ideas that guide it. I'm your host Jana Jöns, a climate policy researcher at Stockholm University, and this podcast is part of the GreenDeal-NET network and the EU Climatic Project. Today we are continuing our series on democracy and climate change in collaboration with the RETOOL project. So last episode we discussed more generally how democracy can be strengthened at the same time that the climate crisis can be addressed. If you haven't listened to that episode, make sure to check it out. Today we are focusing a little bit deeper on one of the democratic innovations we've talked about, namely climate assemblies. We'll explore what they actually are, how they can influence policy, and we'll unpack a little bit how they work, the challenges they face, and how they can encourage climate legislation. I am joined today by Aishwarya Machani, a policy analyst at the Grantham Research Institute, who focuses specifically on climate governance and public participation. Hi, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yes, it's great to have you. So maybe first to begin, we've talked in the past episodes a little bit on climate assemblies exactly, but can you explain a little bit what they actually are and how they work?
Yeah, so climate assemblies are forums that allow people to deliberate on issues related to climate change. So transport, food security and energy. And they bring together a randomly selected group of people who are demographically representative, meaning they're selected according to criteria such as gender, age, level of education, and political views. Participants in climate assemblies typically go through a learning process where they're exposed to evidence with kind of diverse experts or stakeholders, and then they deliberate on the topic in question in small groups and plenary sessions, and then co-create recommendations for policymakers on specific climate issues, as I said, food, transport, energy security.
Mm-hmm. So the participants are then always citizens, or do sometimes other people or other groups also play a role?
Yeah, so we use the word citizens because that's the kind of methodology that we're talking about, citizens' assemblies. But participants in climate assemblies don't necessarily have to be citizens. There are now lots of initiatives to try and get people who don't have citizen status, or migrants, or people who are in a kind of refugee status also involved in these deliberations. So yeah, that's definitely just a methodological point and not meant to be exclusionary.
Yeah, so it can also have a wider group. And as you mentioned, there are some effects that happen for the participants themselves as well, like the social learning that might then enable more climate action in the future, or they might become more aware of all these issues. But what are some other ways these citizen assemblies can be used to support climate governance?
Yeah, so I think these assemblies can really help to support climate governance both procedurally and substantively. So when I say procedurally, that means that they can help to ensure that the voices of those who are really vulnerable to climate change, so young people or people who currently work in carbon-intensive industries, are included in discussions around climate change. They can also ensure that participants are well informed about climate issues, which means that the deliberations tend to be less polarized and geared towards consensus. And then kind of substantively, they can really help governments to make informed decisions about climate policies because they provide a snapshot of public opinion that is both representative and informed. But evidence also suggests that they can actually push governments or provide governments with political cover for more ambitious climate policies, because the recommendations of climate assemblies tend to be more forward-looking and focused on the common good. And I think we now also know that if the effects of on the participants that you mentioned, so social learning and solidarity, trickle down into the wider public, then they can also, climate assemblies can also help to raise wider awareness and depolarize the wider debate around climate change. And I think finally, if they're kind of designed and implemented well, they can also help to strengthen the relationship between decision makers and citizens by kind of providing citizens with a really clear avenue to shape decision making processes.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it then also gives them a bit more ownership of the transition if they feel like they've been involved. And it's interesting what you mentioned, that also policymakers can use them to be like, oh, this, but the climate assembly said that we should do this, so it might enable them to actually take the policies which otherwise they might feel a bit reluctant to take because they're ambitious or they're quite intrusive. And as we've talked in the previous episodes, I mean, there's also been this democratic backsliding. So all of this can sort of push policymakers to still take these difficult decisions and actually implement climate governance, which is really important. So they have lots of benefits then for climate governance, but then the question is, what are some of the challenges they face in actually being implemented well and having this impact that they can have?
Yeah, so I think climate assemblies face kind of immediate constraints that will be facing a lot of the innovations you'll be talking about in this series. So constraints on budget, meaning that they might not have much resources for communications, for example, and that can significantly constrain their ability to have these effects on public debate that I mentioned. But I think climate assemblies also face more kind of structural challenges. So the first being that they kind of inherently only reach a very small proportion of the population. So their reach is limited, and it kind of makes this communications point all the more important. And I think the second thing is whether or not the climate assemblies have impact ultimately depends on the will of the people who commission and organise them. So that means that they can be highly impactful, but they can also become kind of tokenistic exercises. And where climate assemblies are strongly associated with one political party, often we see that they're associated with a left-leaning party or a Green party. It means that their role really fluctuates with electoral cycles. So, I mean, that's an issue because the risk with climate assemblies that don't have impact is that it kind of undermines the value of climate assemblies in people's minds. And in the long term, it could actually undermine rather than strengthen the relationship between decision makers and citizens.
So that speaks a little bit to the fact that citizens, they put so much effort in this assembly, and then they notice that policymakers are actually still not doing anything, or they feel like maybe they've been used in this way, or they've invested, but they don't see the results. So I think that's an important point to stress, sort of this link with the policymaking process. And it's kind of a shame that especially these parties that might already be more climate ambitious, so they might need less of these climate assemblies to have a push forward. They're the ones that are more open to it, and then the parties that could actually benefit also from having these discussions are then perhaps less open. Maybe then, because I know you've also looked at different assemblies in different places, are there some best practices that you identified in how that these climate assemblies can be impactful?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway we've got from our research is that one climate assembly can't fix everything. And I think this is something that policymakers and citizens have to, or the wider public have to accept. But we can find that institutionalizing climate assemblies so that they're really embedded into decision-making processes and cultures can help to make the assemblies themselves more impactful and to hardwire this concept of citizen participation into climate governance. And so this institutionalization can be formal. In Brussels, for example, we see a permanent citizens' assembly on climate, which has been embedded into legislation. Or the institutionalization can be informal. So in Ireland, for example, the repeated use of citizens' assemblies means that decision makers and the public are really familiar with the idea of citizens' assemblies. What I think we really see from the research is that we actually need multiple forms of institutionalization, so there's formal and informal, for climate assemblies to really fulfill their potential to enhance climate policy and the climate debate, and so that they're really immune from backsliding. So I think the recommendation to policy actors is to consider both how climate assemblies can be embedded into and safeguarded in legislation. So that's including kind of ring fencing a budget and resources for them, but also how they can be embedded into the culture. So that's through effective communication strategies, collaboration with media or social movements, and maybe experimenting with methods that invite broader participation. So in Ireland, for example, they've experimented with inviting inputs from the wider public into assemblies, or even organising referenda on the recommendations of assemblies.
And these, both is formal and informal, to me, they seem to speak to what you identified as challenges, right? Like if it is repeated, naturally more citizens will participate in the assembly, so you'll have a wider reach in terms of all these benefits of participation. But then also, as you mentioned, if then the wider public can still have a vote or something, or they can still impact this more limited exercise, they can already be more included, or if they're institutionalized and made more permanent, that deals a little bit with this tension between which parties are organizing this. You know, if it's always being organized and it becomes part of the legislative system, then you will always have them. And ideally, I mean, I guess then you would ideally hope that there will always be a link with the policy making as well. So it's really interesting to see how already in different countries they've tried different methods with I guess, varying success, but to make sure that it works where it is. So thanks a lot for that. Maybe as a final question, we are living a bit in trying times. I think that's an understatement. I don't know, I sometimes get a little bit depressed looking at the news, what is happening in the world, but also when it comes to like climate and energy. So I always like to end a little bit on a message, or like more of a positive message. So I wanted to ask you, is there anything that, despite all this turbulence going on at the moment, that still gives you hope for the future?
Yeah, I think maybe one key thing is that I think if you look at what activists and community organizers are doing around the world, it shows that people aren't kind of waiting for an invitation. They're really mobilizing in their communities, whether that's at the kind of organizational or local level, or maybe even at the global level. And I think that doing what they can do to address climate change. And I think that gives me hope that at some point we'll start seeing a tipping point where more and more people start to engage with climate change. I think especially as its effects become more tangible for many of us.
Yeah, there is power to the people, right? Even if like our world leaders or in the EU or whatever are making all these decisions that are perhaps negative for climate and the environment, there are so many like local initiatives or regional initiatives of cities that keep pushing forward, and people that are getting together and setting up their own communities. And it's indeed really good, or a good reminder that we ourselves can also be the change that we want to see. So thanks a lot for this, and thanks for sharing all your insights on climate assemblies.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal.net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.